listening to the Movements Podcast with Steve Addison. It's the podcast for people who want to multiply disciples and churches everywhere. Today we're going to listen in on Jeff Sundell's report of the story of emerging streams of church planting movements across the United States.
People a week during the week at Bojangles, and we're training them how to share their story, Jesus' story. We're talking about lost people. Our first big thing, most of y'all have heard, is we shifted from using the word lostness to far from God, which really, it gave us a target, and we made that little shift and shifted to far from God, like Neil Ferry's, the guy that sort of helped that happen. It took us 3 months to get in our first house of peace. It took about 6 months to see the first person come to Christ. So that's in 2009. 2009, 2010, it started getting to be where it's a little more normal to hear people come to Christ. So every couple weeks, maybe every couple months, you hear people come to Christ, House of Peace. So first year, we had about, say mid-2010, about 35 groups. And we had, I think we had 89 baptisms that year, roughly. But here, I just want to list some mistakes I think I made. We brought back exactly what we were using in India. And so one of the first things I gave up was oikos mapping. And now y'all know how stupid that was to give up oikos mapping if you've learned oikos mapping. I gave it up because as we shared it, they were like, oh, I don't get this. I don't understand what this oikos mapping thing is. And so we sort of said, well, let's remove that. And then we heard, no, you can't call it church, because it's not good to call it church. So we came up with cute names to call things. So we call them C4 groups. And so we gave up, sort of placated to that issue. So that was two big things. The other big thing we gave up was we had a simple gospel presentation that reproduced in Asia. It has the potential to reproduce in the U.S. And we would find something we hadn't really found before. We'd find people, we'd go share our story. And I'd get somebody say, I'm spiritually interested, but I'm not ready to follow Jesus yet. So we call it the yellow light, And so we have this. Now in Asia, we would go through the 7 commands of Christ. We'd share the gospel, and then if they didn't believe, we'd just go through the 7 commands of Christ. Because you just talk about Jesus in the 7 commands of Christ, right? And we would just do that. Well, we had people go, I'm not going to disciple a lost person. Well, I'm like, well, dude, you're not discipling saved people, man. What are you talking about? You're not discipling a lost person, So anyhow, we got creative, and we went out and created 7 stories of hope. And that was to deal with this issue of the church pushing back on this idea of doing pre-evangelism discipleship, which before in Asia we just did the 7 commands of Christ. Well, now, you see, we're making things complex. So we took simple things and made them complex. Because that's one of the things we said, actually in Houston, we'd evaluate, is going, where are we really seeing 4th generation come to Christ through 7 stories of hope, per se? I know we've seen 2nd generation. I'm not sure if we've seen 3rd generation. But to me, that's one of those things where we listened. I think we listened to the wrong people, I guess is all I'm saying. To me, it was a big mistake. Was listening on those couple issues. All right? So, but again, this is the world we live in, because we're trying to mobilize this part of the body of Christ to hear. So in the spring of 2010, we had a time of fasting and prayer because there was no generational growth. And so there was about 35 or so people began to fast and pray. And I think we fasted and prayed for about 17 days. There was no big, boom, anything like this or, along that line. But we did make one little tweak. We'd been... Essentially, when we came back to the U.S., again, one of the things we shifted from is, storytelling is complex, so let's read it and then tell the story. And then, anyhow, we made a little tweak that summer, and we said, hey, let's go back to storytelling, and let's tell the story, pair up, retell the story, then read it. And anyhow, there seems to be, correlated to that, that's when we began to see some generational growth breakthroughs. I don't know if it was a change in the method, or it was the fasting and prayer. I wouldn't be able to say one way or the other. But I do know that it was after a season where we looked at the obstacle. The obstacle was no generational growth. So we fasted and prayed. We got our Bibles out, and we started in Genesis and worked through the book of Revelation, literally all of us during that fasting and prayer, and trying to look at where did God cause generational growth? And we looked at physical also, not just spiritual. So we looked at the physical generational growth and the spiritual generational growth. But anyhow, it was in that season after that we began to see the first breakthroughs, starting with Mickey, to where we began to see some generational growth begin to happen. And I think the other thing at that point in time is we had another season of fasting and prayer after that. There was sort of three streams. There was Neil Perry, Andy Evans, and our sort of stream right there. And there was a goal to get to 100 groups. And so, again, another season of fasting and prayer. The problem is we actually got to 100 groups really quick. So we've already given up the word church. We were shooting for 100 groups, and we got to 100 groups real quick. But most of them were, I got a guy named Kevin, who some of y'all have met Kevin. Kevin, he eats, sleeps, drinks this all the day long, and he will do this 7 nights a week. And his family will do this 7 nights a week. Well, that's not the normal person over here who does this. Well, the problem is we attracted a lot of guys like that. So we got to 100 groups, but again, a lot of them weren't actually generational. All right? And the problem is if you're working 7 nights a week, if you're working a full-time job, and you're working 6 times a week doing groups, how are you going to keep this going if you're not raising up your Timothys? And so again, I think there was another mistake of, these guys, we were pushing the vision, but they caught the vision of starting these onesies. Okay? And so we got real wide and not very deep. Well, so one of the things that happened is Bobby Welch came over, and I think I'd been with Andy Evans about 3 months before. They had like 37 groups. It's First Baptist Sundell. Well, now Bobby Welch is there. He said, "Yeah, we got how many?" He said, "How many churches you got?" He said, "Well, about 7." He said, "Well, how many other groups you have?" He said, "Well, maybe 5, 6 more." It's like, "Well, where'd those go? Where'd the others go?" "Well, we just had to erase them because we really couldn't keep up with them anymore." So this is when we started seeing this pattern of going, what's going on here? Now, the interesting thing is the churches that originally started as churches actually, for the most part, still exist to this day. The ones that were groups, they've joined churches and they're part of some of these house churches now, and they're part of other local churches. So that should have been a clue early on about the identity piece. But Chuck knows me well. I need repetition. If repetition doesn't work, then I need blunt force trauma. If blunt force trauma doesn't work, then repetitive blunt force trauma usually works with me. So here we had this expansion, and then all of a sudden it's like, man, where'd all that go? What happened? Well, at the same time we get, and I can't think if this is before or after, because Wheaton was a big thing, but I can't think time frame. That was it 2010 or 2011?
2011. December 11.
All right, so it must have been still 2010 because we went over to Nashville. We went to, that would have been 11 though. It was 11 we went to Memphis and trained with Jay?
11.
Okay, so anyhow, we've been in Nashville.
It was early 12.
It was early 12? Okay. So anyhow, I went to Nashville, began training. First did an Apollo training. Then we did another training with David and James. Saw the same thing happen. We sort of placated on the word church. Went after groups. They had about 89 groups going. And I still think we were probably really trying to discern what a house of peace, person of peace was. We were just calling, you're excited anybody's willing to have a spiritual conversation. So that was the first shock. So I think that's, if I would say there's a clear pattern in the U.S., when you're thinking about mobilizing from here back to here, the first one is that there is any spiritual hunger, because we have conditioned ourselves to believe there is none. So the first thing is, oh wow, people are spiritually hungry. The next one is, wow, somebody just gave their life to Christ. Wow, so we're blown away that could happen. And then the next step is that somebody might potentially multiply. And then if that happens, we're just, you still can't talk to me about church, but now you begin to see some multiplication. And, so again, we're a bit shocked. We haven't still dealt with this church issue that's hanging out here. And so there's definitely a pattern of, when we're moving from here to here, about receptivity, people responding, multiplication. Then you got to get to disciple-making groups before you can even talk about church. All right? So this has just been a reoccurring theme that has happened over and over again. But then Wheaton was huge because I think this is when the first big thing was Ray and these guys. We went down to Florida, did training with Bert and their folks, and by now we're really pounding. We got to have 3 touches. We know it takes, if we're going to shift this paradigm to be able to reach down in here, we're going to need these 3 touches. And so one of the first touches.
What do you mean by that, Jeff?
Well, they essentially sort of the basics of who do you share with, what do you say, how do you make disciples, how do you get to group at that point in time. Although we push the idea of church here. We know it's going to take about 3 different times. The same people have to almost hear the same thing. Now it helps if it's like you say it 100 different ways, but you're saying the same thing. And we're just finding in general it takes 3 touches to help somebody at least get to that point of, let's say, getting the multiplication. Now the interesting thing with Burke that was unique among everybody else, what we find here is when people get a hold of the materials, the first thing they want to do is change them. So we were trying to keep the materials real simple what we did in Asia. Most of the time, folks over here, when they got a hold of material, they would make them complex. So the thing that Burke didn't do, he wasn't willing to give his gospel presentation. It was 70-some verses. And it took 6 to 8 months to learn how to share it. But Burke, we were able to push him. Will it be reproducing at NC State University? You got cow farmers. You got guys milking cows. These students can't memorize 70 verses. I mean, come on, Clint Harrell. There's no way. And so we kept pushing Burke on this. And so he got down to 35 verses. Eventually, about 6 months later, he was down to 7 verses. And then Burke, since that point in time, he didn't change anything else. This is one thing, just sort of a personal note after hindsight, looking in the rearview mirror. Some of the early adopters that are most effective early on were people who had a strong background in discipleship and gospel. So I think that's why Navigators is an earlier adopter on this. The Great Commission churches have a strong DNA of gospeling and discipling. So I think that's one of those things, when you look at that DNA, it's very helpful. The interesting thing that the Great Commission Church doesn't is they don't have any inhibitions when it comes to house church. They were birthed out of house church. Now there is a little bit of inhibition, but there's a lot of openness to it. So Burke really didn't change anything. So if we were to just take Burke, I'm pretty sure I'm right on this. They had their first full year cycle of doing T for T. They had 7 streams that went to 4th generation and beyond groups. Now they would call them home groups, but for all intentions, they function like church. So they went from 0 to I think 54 groups with multiplication in their first year. And the only thing they really tweaked was the gospel presentation. Okay. Now I can tell you other people who just put same amount of effort in, but they changed. Well, that gospel presentation won't work here. We need to do this, or hey, that discipleship piece won't work here. Let's. I don't mean they said, hey, let's complicate it. Let's just make it a little more solid, or whatever it may be. And they complicated it, is what happened. So that was the real interesting thing about Burke, is he didn't really mess with that. Then we went over to Memphis.
Maybe it was 11.
Well, the other thing is, by the way, is Jay first came to us, and actually before Wheaton, and took a look. Because again, I'm looking for 3 touches, because that's one of the things I was trying to map my touches. So Jay first came, and we found that was a really good touch if they came and saw. So Jay and some guys came over and saw, and then we went over and did a training at the association. Then you blew it off, only came for 4 hours, but Jay...
You remember that?
Yeah. I was like, I can't believe this young punk, man. Just so
That's hilarious. I didn't even know you knew that I was there.
I remember you sitting over here on the right.
That's funny.
One thing though, when we went to Memphis to train, and it's sort of been the same way with Nashville, is when we went to Memphis to train, we took Andy Evans, Jay, Kevin came with me, and there was one other person in the car. I can't remember who it was. It was one of Kevin's disciples. But anyhow, we swarm trained, and so everybody got up and taught different parts. It was a little messy because of that.
I wouldn't have known.
You wouldn't have known. It was only 4 hours. Yeah. So there was swarm training. Same way in Nashville, swarm training.
What do you mean by swarm training?
We always, as you got somebody new coming along, we found they were effective. Starting to share their story, Jesus' story, they're obeying. If they were willing, we'd bring them with them. The first thing we do is let them share testimony. But if they were able, we would actually throw them out to do part of the training. It makes training very messy, but it's a way to develop your leaders. And then, to me, the high value activity was actually the 10 hours riding in the truck. And then the nights together is where you're developing your leaders. And again, I would sort of base this on Acts chapter 20, Acts chapter 19. We have lots of evidence of these guys swarm training, swarm 0 to 1. So you had all these guys involved in that. And just by the way, then Andy Evans and Jay Pratt start going other places training on their own, training in different associations among the Baptists in a particular area.
Was Clint there at that time?
No. Clint's still far from God at this point in time.
And those that 4 hours changed the rest of my life, to be honest.
That was a good 4 hours, though.
We wouldn't be sitting here right now.
That might have ruined it, though. And so I think the other thing that was huge about this point in time is the Wheaton training, the Houston trainings, because like y'all went down to Houston. But again, I think it added to those extra touches. We needed those 3 touches. I mean, it's just consistent 3 touches. It has been needed all the way along. I'm feeling pretty random the way I'm sharing this.
Gee, that sounds good.
Now it's a harmony between what you're learning going from 4 to 1 and then the storyline. So,
Yeah.
say 2 sets here of thoughts.
Keep going.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
Let me just sort of go back. So as we're going through this, there is starting now, because there's some gen growth. So we're almost into about 2nd, 3rd year in this. So there's beginning to appear to be some gen growth. So Andy's got generational growth in Spindale. There's a guy named Ricky who came out of Andy's work, has generational growth. There's another guy, I forgot his name. Dave, he's seeing generational growth in Spindale. Kevin Jones is seeing generational growth. A guy that Kevin trained named Ricky is seeing generational growth. And most of these guys, now, at this point in time, we're talking about disciple-making gen growth at this point in time. Now, all these guys actually would still be involved in this, and they're actually moved to church planting except for Dave. So all the rest of the guys would be involved, but they're doing church planting now, like in Chesney and Spindale, places like that. So there's getting to be a little bit of going, wow, God's doing something. And then we did a meeting up at this is when Clint actually comes in. We meet up at the log cabin up in the Smoky Mountains. And we did our first mid-level at that point in time.
And I was there the whole time.
Yeah, he came for more than 4 hours. And even stayed awake.
I stayed awake.
The interesting thing is we had a lot of spiritual warfare when we went to do it. A bunch of key folks that day, sickness came in. Crohn's disease, 2 key leaders. Rick Niels Perry's wife got Crohn's disease. He's had it, but it flared up after 18 years. And then a guy named Mark, his daughter has Crohn's disease. She's actually in the hospital right now with Crohn's disease in Charlotte and has been ever since this. And so just the level of, there was a lot of spiritual battles, I think, that weekend in particular.
That was the first mid-level in the U.S., or like...
Yeah, this is the first one we've done. Yeah. And Ray came up to it. And some folks from Columbia, South Carolina. And again, I think we're looking and we're seeing, wow, we see God working, but we're still going, why are we having to do so much of this? And there's a side of movements where, if you think about a bell curve, there's a side where there's a push, and you're pushing, and what you're hoping to get to that tipping point where then you're chasing it, but you want all the DNA set. Well, at this point in time, it still feels like you're pushing a lot, no doubt. But I think another thing that I just sort of marked in the whole thing of this has been Steve's podcasts have been really helpful because it's speeding up people's learning as we're doing this. So by getting the story out, it's actually, when you're meeting people, they're getting further along. So that was a surprise for me because I'm an anti-media guy at that point in time. And so, but anyhow, we just saw the power of media, podcast videos.
Steve's in Australia.
Steve's in Australia. I tell you, saved the day. That's probably soon after that's probably when we connected with Chuck via Steve. And it was that connection there. Actually, a lot of folks would be connected via Steve. Believe it or not, that's a pretty common theme. I wanted to make a point though. One of the things that we began to find at the mid-levels, and this was very different than the U.S. When I first came back, I trained Element Church, and I sort of blame again, but I wouldn't have known any better. I trained them in biblical principles of how to get to movement. That's the way I trained in India. You taught biblical principles, then you gave people tools. But what happened is they actually got overwhelmed with all the biblical principles to the point that they didn't do anything. And it was I just gave them too much. Well, the big thing I learned, and it took me a long time, it took me about 2 years. Again, I'm slow. And I don't like this, but the thing I've noticed about the U.S. is you actually almost have to start with methods and tools. Give them methods and tools. And then what you have to do is use the mid-levels to move them to biblical principles. That's not the way it happened in South Asia. We started with biblical principles and then gave them tools. And then we refined things as we went. Well, the U.S. has been totally flip-flop. And so anyhow, I made a lot of mistakes early on because I pounded principles. And people couldn't stomach the principles. Again, I don't know how you would have done it except just learn by trial and error. So the big difference with mid-levels for us in the U.S., in my mind, is once you get tools, if you use the tools and trust them and don't mess with them too much, they will move you a certain distance, but you're going to come up with obstacles. But the mid-levels, you got to backfill with biblical principles. And I think everybody in this room, that's where a lot of us, we were moving from, hey, here's good tools, T for T methodology, but now we're being rooted in Scripture, and I'm no longer standing on a T for T book. I'm standing on the Word of God. And thus saith the Lord. So why are we doing immediate baptism? Why are we planting churches? Why are we doing this to the point of no place left? And so that's been that's been a big transition with the mid-levels. So that's just one of those cultural things that's a little different. I'll just show this real quick, but I don't know if it'll help you or confuse you. This is just sort of this is crisscrossing the U.S., but this is just sort of I sort of took, I think that's brown, then blue. The purple looks like blue too, and then orange and red. But again, if you just sort of look back to a lot of these places, there's been multiple touches. Whether it was through a push event, or whether it was through a training, or a Wheaton training, or a Houston training, a Denver training, I just started seeing there's these multiple touches again. The three different touches is a normal pattern. Almost every one of these trainings would have been done in a swarm. There was very few of these where it was Jeff only. Most every single one of these trainings has been done through multiple people training. Does lead to some confusion, does create problems, but I think it's a really good thing. And I'm going to reflect back to South Asia. I remember after I'd gotten Nathan Shank, and I did a model assist watch and lead with Nathan. I did 3 trainings on the front end, and we'd taken Acts 29 and shortened it to 2.5 days to what actually now becomes 4 fields. And we modeled, and then the next thing Nathan taught. And then the next one, Nathan and a guy named Lee Puck and Carey, they taught most of it, and then they did a 4th one, and I left. Well, we come back a year later, and we're up over 120 churches, a couple thousand baptisms in that area with these guys now. And I grab my national partner named Kunsong, and I get down to Sri Lanka, and I go to a guy named Steve Crittenden, and I do a training in Sri Lanka, and we do 3 trainings back-to-back with his team. Well, the interesting thing is, when I went and did that, I could count 11 more trainings going on while I was in Sri Lanka from internal momentum within the beginnings of this new chunk of a movement. We already had a little bit of a movement going on towards Bhutan and back in the Nepal area, but now here's this new chunk, and there's 11 trainings going on that I don't have anything to do with. Well, to me, that's one of those really, really good signs is when that's happening. Well, that's actually just recently, in say the last 2 years, that's something that's getting to be more common. Is I can know that I'm over here training, and I know somebody else is training here and here and here and here, let alone weekly rollouts, because weekly is the main way we roll these out. Right? So that's one of those really good signs right now that's been a shift from, say, the first 2 years was just a handful of people, but there's a lot of people now training in the U.S.
So Jeff, let me clarify something you just said, because I think we may be missing this, and I'm going to write these things down so I'll let you hold your own poster.
Okay.
But you're doing 2 types of trainings. In Charlotte, you're doing weekly trainings.
Yes.
Okay. But the 3 touches is when you're going to the Clevelands and all of these other Memphis, is when you're saying, I want to make sure these guys get 3 touches as we're trying to kick something off in a new concept. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, because I think we might miss the picture if we're saying Jeff's giving 3 touches to people in Charlotte.
Yeah.
That's not what you're doing.
No.
That's where you're doing a weekly T for T with these guys. What you're saying is we try to go over to Memphis. Okay, I want to make sure these guys get 3 touches, and then they're doing training with me in other contexts. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, and even like Daniel's helped me in Atlanta. Of course, y'all have helped me. I've helped you, right? I've helped Ray. Ray's helped me. So I don't think. Maybe I haven't been. We haven't done anything together. But in the U.S., I think everybody in here, we've all co-trained something. Where either I led it or you led it, and I helped you.
The best part about it is now there's such a cross-pollination where we've all come down and helped Troy. Troy's come over here. So it's created a nice cross-pollination within the trainers. Not just you. No longer is the point of contact for everyone else.
Exactly. So if I go out of the picture, I'm not. It's no big deal.
Can you just name the places on this map so we can see it? Go chronologically.
Okay, I'll do the best. So if we sort of start here, this is obviously Booger Hollow, North Carolina. You notice it's the center of the universe. It's a Booger Hollow centric map.
Is there a Booger Hollow National Airport?
Someday. So these, of course, this is Spindale. This is Forest City. This is Chesney. This is where we began to see some of the first gen growth. Then the Charlotte sort of became the next Charlotte. I don't know where Nashville went. Nashville, Knoxville, and again, the other thing is you got. There's a really interesting thing with the Tennessee Baptist State Convention. They came down. That's one of the touches. Then in Knoxville, we train all of their regional leaders. They have regions over their metroplexes. Train those guys. Their push is they have a thing called 151. So everybody starts one group, baptizes 5 people, and those 5 start one group. And Bobby Welch says if you don't do it, you get fired. So it's Jesus said. So the interesting thing is when I was watching the videos of the Tennessee Baptist Convention here recently, and the first couple guys I was going, yeah, I trained him. Well, then the next guy says, well, I was trained by James. I was trained by David. And we had 79 baptisms. I was trained by him. We had 7 baptisms. And I was trained by, and it was pretty amazing to see because the first video was just David, James, and a handful of guys we trained. And then you saw all these other guys trained by these guys. And so again, we'll have to wait and see what that looks like. Knoxville, we got 3 touches in Knoxville. We got a little derailed, but the cool thing is, again, occasionally I'm looking for generals. And occasionally, generals sometimes don't need 3 touches. But there was a guy named Jeff Calloway who was with the North American Mission Board. And so they've gone up to Cleveland, Tennessee, and they're seeing multiplication in Cleveland, Ohio. And then there's a guy named David down in Medina, which is just south, and they're seeing multiplication. Never been able to get them to a med level. Never been able to get them to another training. I can communicate with them. We've invited them numerous times and numerous things, but we haven't been able to do anything with them. But they actually have a church up there that's now seeing multiplication. So a traditional church in the downtown area. So there's been some really amazing things here. It was interesting. A lot of these guys came to Knoxville. There were some great guys out of that training that went back up to these areas. We had an Eritrean guy came down to Nashville, went back up seeing multiplication in Columbus, Ohio. You guys, of course, the other thing is you guys came from Indy down with Gary Stump and your crew down to Knoxville, and came over and hung out in Booger Holler. Then we went up and did a mid-level up there with Gary. So I don't know if I'm doing real well chronologically. And then, so essentially, all of this, then in North Carolina, we trained all the metroplexes. The only one, though, we really got the number of touches we needed with was the Asian. There's a group of Asians that plant churches for the Baptists in North Carolina, and we've actually had multiple touches with these guys. I think it's right here. And again, got some really intuitive guys. So there's a Filipino guy, very intuitive, and he just started picking up on this stuff. And so he had 3 touches. So he came to a training. I did a training with him, and then we did a couple times where we just hung out and just talked through things. And he was obviously very intuitive. And so he's run this, and then we did a training with the nice thing is the Asians adopted this because it didn't cost anything. So they can't afford this LifeWay material. It's too expensive. So they like this as just the Bible. And so we trained all the Asian church planters in North Carolina who are using this. On things like that, that's the hard thing when you do this. You talk about Tennessee Baptist Convention, you talk about North Carolina, trained all the metroplexes. In a lot of ways, I know a lot of people probably didn't do anything, but there's others, there's stuff going on, but I don't honestly know the truth of, say, the Asian work, what's going on. Because Ralph is such a good coach, there's been no need for me.
We're going to have to break for lunch. So walk us down through 2012, 2013. There's a lot of those arrows on here.
Yeah, and again, we're sort of wrapping up the metroplexes in North Carolina, but then through the MUPS training out in Texas, we meet Fred and Melissa. And then, of course, a huge innovation here for all of us has been the House of Peace Search. So that was one of those, again, I think that's the power of the community of learning. It just gave us handles. We understood the House of Peace concept, but sometimes what we need is handles. So we believe the principle, or the fourth soil principle, but now we have this tool so far that's been transferable. So if we step back over to here, the first days in Booger Hollow, we're struggling Well, now we got a tool that's consistently working in a lot of places with that House of Peace tool. And then we got some gospel presentations. We know we got 3 or 4 gospel presentations that have gotten to 4th generation. I think the 3 circles with Jimmy Scroggins is going to get the 4th generation. So we're starting to see that happen. But again, you're talking multiple touches here. Whether y'all come up and I forgot about Boston. Y'all came up and helped me in Boston. Then we've come down here. You helped me in Dallas. Was the other place Hearst? Something in South Fort Worth. Has to do with Oldsmobile, I think, in muscle cars, but it has to do with something with muscle cars. So, and then I think the other thing that just this was a huge piece, I think, and it was really Fred's idea, was bringing Steve and other practitioners in to help us at the mid-level. Because if not, we were the Tar Heel Lodge was great. Sort of the best we could do at the Tar Heel Lodge. There was 40 days of fasting and prayer, and Chuck overachieved and read the New Testament through 10 times. The rest of us really never got that far. I think I got about 7 or 8 times through, and it's like, wow, But it was. But I think the really great thing is, one, we were amazed at what God was doing through Fred and Melissa and Chuck and Deb and other people. But I think what really just took us light years ahead was having, Steve, you guys coming in was huge for us, and Ying and Grace and Bill Smith, and it just I don't know where else in the world you could have pulled that off. But I think that has tremendously, because to me the goal of leadership is to get leaders shoulder height as rapidly as possible. Now you can't create the depth from the experience. But I think those events have been catalytic in nature to get that, which was very unique. Of course, the big one, December last year, was we had the aha moment of, again, I screwed up the DNA early on because I placated to this, again, but we wouldn't have had the voice. If we don't go after disciple making, we don't go after discipleship multiplication, we don't get the voice to talk about church. Well, now we got a voice to talk about church, but it's like going around your back to scratch your butt, I had to throw it in eventually. It's a lot easier to go this way.
So glad you explained that.
It's a good visual, isn't it?
By the way, I think it's lunchtime.
I don't even remember what I was talking about there. But the big shift there, I think for us, was we all everybody had the aha moment of going, wow, we have got to get to church. Because I think you guys, you had all these disciple-making groups, and you went and took the eraser, and all of us have done it. And we've literally erased, the truth is, thousands of groups. Yeah. Now, the good thing is people came to Christ. People multiplied. I mean, there's good things happening. But we've done this in every city. It's a fact. And it just seems to be, as we're going to help this group move to here, it's going to be a normal thing that happens. Now, hopefully, eventually, we're going to be able to convince people. Now, Chuck was much smarter than most of us, and he just went straight for church. But we've seen, James and David shifted completely to church. Now engaging 30 different UPGs and UUPGs in Nashville. I think leading the nation on that piece. And there's the guy named Kika, who was trained with me while I was trained by Bruce Carlton in Texas, and he's blowing the doors off too. And then I think the other, I think there's a community of learning. Or an attitude of learning, because I think it's one of the big things I learned from David Garrison is we need to be an attitude of learners. That if we ever get to the point we think we've got it all together, we've lost it. And so I think having that attitude of communicating that we are learners and failing forward in the midst of this. And I guess right now the next big piece for me and chronologically was. I think you had a sense of God's up to something December last year, or that was 13. But I think this most recent one in Houston, when Bill Smith emotional and Curtis Sargent emotional,
Whoa.
and they, it's a challenge, right? But just to see, that they both were going, wow.
Yeah.
Curtis saying, hey, what you're seeing in this room is similar to what we're seeing in this room around the country. And just the sense of, wow, that God is up to something. So I think all of us are still going, it feels very, it'd all fall apart tomorrow.
Yeah.
But it's so different than it was, say, 3 years ago.
Yeah.
That's right.
And I think the maturity of the level of leadership has matured tremendously. But then, Bill Smith just emotionally saying, I didn't think this was possible to see in my lifetime, that this might be something that happens. So, and I'm holding on to that.
That's right.
Because that feeling that we had on Houston that Saturday afternoon, because, it wouldn't have been for sure.